There's nothing like St. Patrick's Day when it comes to proving Boston's appeal for destination drinking. That especially goes for high-volume establishments near downtown. But if you're talking about alcohol served with a meal in other parts of the city or encouraging a nightlife that's more diverse, that's a different story. And that story is being fleshed out by Dig Boston in collaboration with the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, or BINGE. Joining us from BINGE are staff reporter Haley Hamilton and the director of editorial, Chris Ferrone. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to start with Haley. As a result of this disparity in licenses, what is it that we're missing in Boston?
It's going to depend on where you live. If you are in the North End, you are pretty well set. If you're living in Roxbury or Mattapan or a less developed part of the city, you really are just missing a place where you can go and socialize, have a drink, a neighborhood spot, if you will.
Chris, what about what this means for the character of the city, the flavor of the city? Because if you don't fit into that crowd that goes to one of these high-volume places downtown, what are your alternatives?
Well, there's not that many, and I think for people who do live in Back Bay, for example, that Copley area, where there's more than 100 places to go drinking there, it's hard to even imagine living in a place like Dudley Square, where up until a couple of weeks ago there was maybe one, and that's kind of like a striptease establishment of sorts. There are a couple, but what's missing is anything. And also, don't forget, that's where jobs are. So if everybody who lives in the whole Dudley Square area is always going to other parts of the city, that's where their money's going. So people can earn money in other parts of the city, but they're not bringing it, jobs to that immediate vicinity. So what really you end up with, not only a desert for a place to go out, but really just lack of opportunity.
Haley, we do have more places in Boston than ever before where you can get some great food, but explain how alcohol works into the economics around that.
So, having worked in a restaurant and knowing people in the industry, a lot of your money is made on the bar. So for a restaurant to be successful, not always, but a large part of the time, your food markup falls between like 30 and 60% on the menu. Your alcohol can go for as much as 500% as what you bought it for. So we all know, why would I buy a $9 glass of wine when I know I can get the whole bottle for $11? Well, that's where they're making their money. So having a great restaurant is great. A lot of times, you're unable to charge as much for certain things because you're not going to have alcohol on the menu. And a lot of times when people want to go out, they want something they might not have in their own home. They might not have that nice bottle of Cabernet. They might not have what it takes to make a Manhattan at home. So you're missing out on two levels there.
Chris, you spent a lot of time at Binge trying to look into this. Why was it worth so much time?
I think that at Binge we do long form projects, big projects that your average community papers don't ordinarily do. So of course, like you said, we have to pick what are we actually going to look at. With the liquor license situation, as a reporter in this city for more than 10 years now an editor, it's just one of these things where nobody really knows what's up. There are some things that people know. There are vestiges to throwbacks to the old State House and the way the Brahmins didn't want Irish to have control. People know that. People know there's a cap. People know loosely that it creates a disparity. But why? This is one of the huge, it's the reason that our city looks the way it does, that the map of culture, of nightlife does. If you were to trace the train routes, the trains go to places where there are liquor licenses. So I think it was so important, and is now, as Boston moves forward into this, innovation capital of the world or whatever it may be, it's important to know why the map looks the way it does and why there is still, even with all this opportunity happening elsewhere, why there's still such inequity in certain parts of the city.
Haley, maybe when this cap started, the intent was to keep the city from being awash in alcohol, but explain how this works. You limit the supply, and what does that do to the exchange value of these?
The exchange value skyrockets. Supply and demand takes over. So without any that are able to be, given out by the city, anyone who holds one, it goes to the highest bidder. So you have licenses going for $350,000, $400,000, which is immediately going to not even cut in half, but just decimate the people who are thinking about opening a restaurant.
And once you buy one of these, I guess you have to figure out how to make money off it. So I guess that also determines the character of your establishment.
Yep, it would. So if you're that far in the hole already to be able to serve, if your original plan isn't as lucrative as you thought it might be, I don't see what you just turn around and sell it, or anything you got, right?
Chris, one of the things that's surprising, and I was reading Haley's story, is that when there was some action at the State House recently to change the situation, one of the legislators said that, no, actually there isn't a cap. People in Boston can create as many of these licenses as they please.
I think that was Barbara L'Italienne, who is not a Boston representative. So I think it's, by the way, and we haven't said it yet on the show, but Boston's the only place that has this rule. Every other, what is it, 351 or 350 other municipalities in the state have a different rule. I mean, it's that ridiculous. So other lawmakers from elsewhere didn't even realize it. So Haley profiles this meeting at the State House where people from Boston, politicians from Boston, advocates from Boston were trying to get more licenses here, and they were like, "Why are we even doing this? What is?" But they don't even get it because Boston is living in 100 years ago as far as this is concerned.
Kelly, what has also been happening is that people have been working on this issue for a while, at least a decade. And there have been at least some attempts to remedy the situation. Talk about that, because I guess they weren't as effective as they were supposed to be.
So a decade is about right. In 2006 was the first time we had new licenses released, as it were, into the wild, into the Boston market. And those were designated for certain areas that were deemed urban renewal zones or Main Streets districts. They also had, how do they phrase it? Harbor something plans, but there were maps that were drawn as to if we're going to make new licenses available, they need to go to these kinds of areas. Most of them were underdeveloped and in traditionally neighborhoods by peoples of color. None of those licenses, to the best of our knowledge, ended up in Roxbury or Mattapan or Dorchester. Most of them went to the Seaport, a few of them in the North End. Most recently, we've had some introduced, started in 2014. Ayanna Pressley passed a home rule petition to put 75 licenses over the course of 3 years out. That's great. We've had a few of those land in Dorchester, a couple have gone to Roxbury, but in 2017 we're back to square one because we won't have any more.
Chris, what about the mapping of these licenses that were supposed to go into certain places where they were more needed? Was there some gerrymandering or something here?
Well, this is a great show to talk, because I know people watch your show. The bureaucratic rigmarole that ensued with this. I mean, it's almost quite simple. There were economic empowerment zones and zones where they were needed, and lawmakers and everybody who wanted to slip a favor to a friend in the restaurant business, they found ways to put maps on top of maps, expand this, expand that. Suddenly, Roxbury becomes the South End. This is Boston. It's not New York. There's not clear-cut lines between so-called neighborhoods. So really, they fudged that. In fact, you had the head of the Boston Licensing Board at the time saying, well, we could have the BRA stretch this and do that. So that's what it was. It was malleable, whereas that was not the intention. And we have former Senator Diane Wilkerson, who obviously ran into some trouble over these issues, gave us a comment for the story and explains that wasn't the intention. The intention of legislation was to free up 50 to 60 licenses for those neighborhoods that we've mentioned, and also like Hyde Park and places like that.
And of course, I mean, if there wasn't this kind of artificial scarcity, that no one would have bothered trying to bribe a legislator.
It's. I think for people in other parts of the country, the whole thing still doesn't make any sense.
Can you talk about some of the recent licenses in some of the outlying neighborhoods? And I know these are mostly smaller establishments, some good food involved, and maybe a lot of friendly neighbor character too. Are these licenses helping the businesses, you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think the one for sure, Caravania in Hyde Park. I was not there on this trip, but Ayanna Pressley did a quick tour across the city in October and highlighted a few of the restaurants that had recently gotten a license. And the owner of Caravania said that their sales have increased 30% since they are able to sell alcohol. And they have just a beer and wine license. So.
Chris, what about some of the other possibilities here? Because I understand that there's a secondary market for licenses. I still don't understand. How does that work?
It's controversial, right? So there's this secondary market, and where licenses can go up to $350,000, $400,000. That's a public license that originated with a $3,000 fee, plus or minus lawyer fees. But it works that when the supply is up, I mean, when the demand is up and there's not much supply, they can go really high, and it just totally knocks anybody out. Like Kelly said, anybody who, let's say, a couple people who are in the restaurant business want to even put together their savings, it puts it out of the range of that. It makes it so that it's a chain restaurant or a big national corporation that can afford that. Because don't forget, even if that license is costing $350,000. Plus everything else that needs to get done. I mean, a restaurant has a lot of moving parts, but that is kind of like a foundation. It's needed.
Haley, one of the other complicating factors here is that it is tricky to allow more licenses in parts of the city without scaring people in the other neighborhoods where there really is maybe a glut of liquor and liquor plus food. So how do you avoid that?
By having more licenses available to certain parts of town?
Yes. I mean, in other words, is there a way that you can give licenses, let's say, to Hyde Park, Rosendale, Dorchester, Mattapian, and not worry about scaring people in the North End?
In the North End. So that's part of what this last batch has done. They were designated specifically, well, most of them. So there's 75 released, 25 each year. 10 are all alcohol and 15?
Well, I think 10 of them go from ones that were beer and wine that can now have all alcohol, and then there's a split between the rest.
Yeah, so a majority of those licenses, so I think 60 of the 75 are restricted to certain neighborhoods, and the other 15 are up for places outside those zones. But for the most part, those could only go to certain areas.
Chris, the other thing you want to do is if you do have more of these licenses, you want to make them look economically attractive to a small business person. At the same time, you don't want them to profiteer. How do you avoid that?
Well, I think that you make sure they stay non-transferable. And we have a second part of this story coming out next week, also in Dig Boston and in El Planeta in Spanish, where Haley really, and she'll explain, really gets into how they don't really track them. So the ones that are supposed to be for certain neighborhoods, say one's released in 2006, there is, and I don't misuse the word literally no way to really know, where those went and if they're still in districts that they were intended for. So the way to avoid it is to keep basic track of them.
Yeah, well, and to have them be non-transferable is if you close up shop or you decide you no longer want the license, it has to be returned to the city. So you've used it, congratulations, you've paid your fee, now we're done, it goes back instead of being up on the open market.
By the way, Haley, we're talking about action at the State House. Do you see anything coming out anytime soon to change the way things are being run?
I don't think there's much that can be done right now until 2017 when the last set of these will have been dispersed, if you will, because that will be a really good place to show, look, we're now back where we started.
Chris, there's also, I guess, a discussion in the community that's coming up about this, maybe toward the end of the month?
Yeah, so there's the second part of this runs next week, and then the week after that, Tuesday the 29th of March at Dudley Doe, and we'll have some pizzas, some beers, and it's a celebration of, look at where we're having it, right in Dudley Square. Even a year ago, we could not have dreamed of having, now there's 3 places, I think, in the bowling building alone where you can have a beer and wine. And they're still not really sit-down bars like the way they are in the rest of the city, but this isn't about like binge drinking. Sure, the article's pegged to St. Patrick's Day, but it's really like Haley started out at the beginning saying about people can have a drink in their neighborhood. That's a big difference from where we were just even a year ago.